All right, well, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's 3 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. I am recording today, so if there are any opportunities for us to talk about specific students today, just a reminder to avoid using any personally identifiable information. And as we welcome a few more people as they're joining us, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment and writing in the chat your role, and if you want to share with us where you are, that's welcome too. We're very curious to see how many ESOL educators, how many special educators, and maybe some who do both are with us today. And thank you so much for taking time out of your afternoon to come and learn with us about this guidance manual that we're all very, very excited to share with you. And I'll introduce myself. My name is April Perkins, and I am the English for Speakers of Other Languages and Bilingual Programs Specialist here at the department. And I am presenting today with two wonderful colleagues. Leora, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Leora Byris. I work for the Office of Special Services on the Federal General Supervision and Monitoring team.
Thanks, Leora. And Robin?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robin Fleck, and I'm an ESOL consultant, and I work in the department with April and Rebecca Carey.
Thank you both very much. So let's look at our objectives for today. And just to make sure that everyone is aware, this is an overview, but there are 3 more sessions planned for the coming months. So today will be a general informational session, but I hope that you're able to attend those 3 sort of deeper dives. And for more information about the dates of those and to register, you can subscribe to the ESOL listserv. You can also subscribe to the Maine DOE newsroom, and you'll find information about that there, or you can reach out to me directly and I'll be happy to send you that information. So for today's session, we're going to be giving you a general overview of the new guidance manual, talking in just a little bit of detail about some of the information and resources within each section, responding to questions that you may have, and then offering suggestions for you for further learning. First and foremost, yes, so I see a question in the chat. The PowerPoint will be posted to the Maine DOE website. It will be on the Multilingual Learners Professional Learning page, and then perhaps Leora or Special Services may have another place to post it to make sure everyone can find it. And the recording of today's session will be available on the Maine DOE YouTube channel. It should be up as soon as tomorrow, most likely. So thank you for that question. I did want to start off making sure that everyone is aware of a change in terminology that occurred toward the end of last school year. In the past, we referred to students who are in the process of learning English as English learners, but we made the switch last school year to referring to such students as multilingual learners. And that's something that a number of other states have also done, and WIDA, if you're familiar with that organization, they've also made that shift to primarily referring to students as multilingual learners. And the reason that we did that is we want to be very deliberate in our choice to use asset-based language. And the term multilingual learners acknowledges the rich linguistic assets that students bring with them. Oftentimes, students speak not only 1 or 2 languages, but 3, 4, 5 languages. So we really want to celebrate and recognize that. So I encourage you to adopt this terminology into your own use and into your school communities as best you can, and let me know if I can help with that in any way. Next slide. So this is a long time in the making, a really massive undertaking to provide this guidance manual for you. And we're so excited to finally be able to share it with the field so that it can hopefully make some really wonderful differences for you and for your students. And the reason we created this manual is that we, of course, receive questions from educators in the field every day. And many of the questions that we were responding to, we found centered on this very topic of how do I identify a student who is a multilingual learner with a suspected disability? And it is something that's very difficult to summarize in the response to an email. So we found ourselves understanding a great need for some extensive guidance around the topic. And several other states paved the road for us ahead of us. And we thank them for all of the work that they put in that we were able to benefit from. In particular, the Virginia Department of Education, we found that their guidance manual was extremely well done and provided a really nice roadmap for us in creating our own. And they did give us permission to adapt their guidance manual to this context here in Maine. And we're very, very grateful for that permission. So if you are familiar already with the Virginia guidance, then you will see a lot of similarities between that guidance manual and ours. But we really did take a lot of time and put a lot of thought towards how we could make sure that it was relevant and meaningful for Maine educators. So you'll see throughout the guidance lots of references to Maine statute, policy, and regulation. Oh, sorry, just a moment on that last slide. Thank you. I also want to make sure that you're aware that this was not created by any one individual, but really it was a huge team effort to make sure that this guidance manual addresses the needs of everyone. And so Robin, Maureen Fox, who also worked with us as a consultant, and Leora and a few others on the special services team, as well as others across the department, including Jody Basio-Smith, who is here, helped review it for us. And the other names that you see listed here, Sylvia DeRuvo, Dr. Melissa Cuba, MASP also did take a look at it for us, and the Multilingual Learner Advisory Council. And so with all of those cooks in the kitchen, we're feeling confident that what we've created for you will hopefully be a very, very helpful document with lots of different perspectives incorporated. Okay. So this is the outline of the contents of the manual. I want to make sure also that you do have the link to the manual in case you wanted to look at it as we're going through the session today. I added it earlier, but I'm going to grab it again for those of you who have arrived now. Don't be discouraged or intimidated by the length of the document. It is a very long document, but we hope that it's been organized in such a way that you can really go to the section that provides the information that you most need in that moment. And as I said earlier today, there will be 3 further sessions that help break down the pieces of what's included in this manual. So these are just the general sections that we've included. Next slide. And the first section of the manual gets into the legal requirements that form the foundation for the guidance. So I'll let Leora talk for a moment about IDEA and user.
Hi, so IDEA, as you know, was reauthorized in 2014, and MUSER, the Maine Unified Special Education Regulation, some of you may be aware, is actually in rewrite right now, but it will not go to legislation until I think next year at this point. But MUSER is, of course, based on IDEA, although there are a few places where Maine goes above and beyond IDEA regulations, which I always think is kind of nice. But those are what is referenced throughout the document for pertaining to special education laws and regulations.
And then you'll also find referenced throughout the guidance federal civil rights law, which is primarily based in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which says that students who are multilingual learners who also are identified for special education have many rights that pertain to each of those identifications, which we'll go into in just a few moments. And then the Every Student Succeeds Act, also known as ESSA, which is a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. That has some specific requirements in there related to multilingual learners, including statewide uniform identification procedures and annual assessment of English language proficiency. So those are a couple of the big things that are included. There are also accountability requirements within ESSA so that we are looking at subgroups of students and their performance, so that pertains to this work as well. Next slide.
So we just wanted to draw your attention quickly to the fact that the IDEA and federal civil rights guidance prohibit a policy of delaying evaluations to determine the need for special education and related services. So what that means, of course, is that if you are questioning whether a multilingual learner also may benefit from special education because of a suspected disability, you would go through all of the evaluation and referral procedure in MUSER, and there is that is detailed in the manual as well.
The intervention procedures section of the guide has a section on factors that could result in misidentification of a student who is a multilingual learner. Sometimes students are referred for an evaluation when there have been poor instructional practices or a lack of or weak intervention strategies. Sometimes there's an inappropriate use of assessment tools, or sometimes there can even be a lack of understanding of the linguistic differences between English and the student's primary language, which could result in a referral to speech. So the intervention procedures section is where you want to look for that information. And you can see that in Chapter 6 of the U.S. Department of Education English Learner Toolkit, there's also more information about misidentification, and there are several links in the guide to these types of resources.
And just for a moment to go back to something that Leora mentioned about the timeline, that there has been this pervasive thought that it was important to wait a period, for example, of about 3 years before a multilingual learner might be evaluated for a potential disability. And so we really want to be clear in expressing that that policy of having a set amount of time that a student must wait for evaluation is not something that is appropriate under civil rights or IDEA law. When evaluating a student who has a suspected disability, there are multiple approaches that may be taken. And these are 3 potential ways that a student, or 3 routes linguistically through which a student might be evaluated. It could be entirely in the student's primary or home language. And that would be probably the most difficult thing to accomplish in many cases, depending on what language it is that the student speaks or uses, because you would need to have a bilingual staff member or potentially a trained interpreter in order to do that. It could be in both the primary or home language and English, or it could be in English only. And very clearly articulated in the guidance manual is this idea that students need to be evaluated in the language that is most likely to yield accurate information about them. So I think it might be traditional practice to evaluate students in English, but when we're talking about a student who is still in their process of acquiring English, that can give us an incomplete picture and sometimes an inaccurate picture of their abilities. So to get as much meaningful information as we can about what students know and can do, it needs to be in a language that allows them to demonstrate that for us.
Pardon me. So we got guidance from the Maine Association of School Psychology. We have their input and some guidance on the evaluation process in the guide. And you'll notice that there's also a link here for their resource, which is specific to the specific learning disability eligibility form. But they have information in that in their own manual about assessing multilingual learners as well. The determination of eligibility for special education and related services. So again, this comes right out of IDEA and MUSER. And there's a piece of it that says that a student must not be determined eligible for special education and related services if the determinant factor is limited English proficiency or lack of instruction in reading and math. And what, of course, that means in practice is that if you suspect that a multilingual learner has a disability, then you can do a referral process, or the parents can, or the district, in order to have that, to start the MTSS process and have that in the evaluation process move forward.
The manual has a flow chart, and I hope you can see it well enough on the slide. It's better when you can enlarge it fully. But after a student enrolls and undergoes the multilingual learner ID process and confirms their status as a multilingual learner, there's different pathways. And if there's no disability suspected at the time, the student, and then as the year goes on and there are concerns that arise, the student should be referred to the school-based support team. So that might be an MTSS team, an RTI team, always with the collaboration with your ESOL teacher. In all of these pathways, we are looking for the ESOL staff to be a part of the process of working with the student and the family. If a parent has discussed some concern about their child's learning in the enrollment process, the ESOL teacher should be alerted, as well as the classroom teacher, and they should start to collect data and also make an effort to collect additional student background information. And these pathways are all detailed in the manual. If a parent or guardian reports a presence of a disability, there's another pathway where the special education and ESOL teachers are notified to determine what types of supports are needed to assess the English language proficiency and how this student will begin school safely, again, incorporating all the information that's necessary, if there's medical information available or any other information that can be brought in determining the nature and significance of a disability. And if a student has an existing IEP from another district, state, or country, then the special education and ESOL teachers are notified and they determine the initial program placement with an IEP transfer meeting taking place within 30 school days. We want the ESOL teacher to be a part of that IEP meeting. Leora, do you have anything to add to that process? No. Okay. All set.
Okay, so looking at eligibility for special education. So a student shall be determined eligible and classified eligible for special education and related services when the student has one or more of the disabilities defined in user. And those are the same 13 disability categories that are based on IDEA. So specific learning disabilities, speech and language, other health impairment, for example. The disability adversely affects the student's educational performance. So the team would go through the evaluation process and fill out one of the 3 eligibility forms for the suspected disability, and that all 3 of the eligibility forms walk the team through that process of whether or not the disability is to such a degree that it adversely affects the child's ability to access FAPE, free appropriate public education, and that the student is in need of special education and related services. So, and there's just a reminder on the bottom that evaluations or this process shouldn't be delayed, even though that was old practice. Now we're updating practice, so we don't want that to be delayed. And this is Maine's initial timeline for initial referral. Some of you may be familiar with it. This is actually Eric Herlin, who teaches a special education law class, and he works with Drummond and Woodsum. So this goes through the entire process from start to finish. So the first piece is that the district receives a referral order. So every district in Maine has their own referral policy because Maine's a local control state. So they get the referral to special education that there's a disability affected. And then there's a team meeting to make some decisions on evaluation. It's very important that parents be involved in that as well. Then the parent is provided the permission, the consent to evaluate so that the team can get those evaluations done. And that starts the 45-day timeline, school day timeline to get the evaluations done. Important to remember that if you're talking about a 3 to 5-year-old, that timeline is actually 60 school days. So they have a longer window there to get those evaluations done. So the evaluations come back within those 45 school days. Oh, pardon me. Thank you, Deb Mullis. I appreciate that, 60 calendar days. The team meeting happens where the evaluations are reviewed. The team makes eligibility determinations, fills out an eligibility form. And then if the team determines that there is an adverse effect, there is indeed a disability, then the team needs to prepare an IEP, which needs to start no later than 30 calendar days from that meeting. So that's the timeline, and I sort of went through it quickly, but it is in your PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so if the child is found eligible for special education, there is evidence of a disability based on the evaluations, then the team needs to meet within 30 calendar days to have the IEP in place. And it's important that there be an interpreter as needed as part of that process. And then all of the timelines are just, again, based on user. So the student's IEP team needs to meet annually to review and revise the IEP as long as the child is found eligible.
So we included this chart in the manual so you could see that in the world of English for speakers of other languages, there is a plan that we call an ILAP, which is an individual language acquisition plan. And a student with an identified disability has an IEP, an individualized education plan. And so this chart was laid out so that you could see the legal references, who the education team comprises of, the purpose of each of the plans, what the goals and services would look like, the assessment pieces, how progress is reported, and where the responsibilities lie. But I think one of the biggest things that we'd like to emphasize is the need for collaboration between the ESOL staff, the classroom content teacher staff, and the special education staff, really in creating both of these plans at the IEP meeting and at the language assessment committee meeting, where the ILAP is going to be developed and then annually reviewed as well.
And as Robin was saying, students who have both identifications, qualify both for special education and for ESOL services, must be provided both kinds of services. One of the most common questions that comes my way from ESOL teachers is they may have a student who has an identified disability, and they wonder whether the student should be continuing to receive ESOL supports or not, perhaps thinking that it is the student's disability that is the primary need for that student. But my response is always the same, that as long as the student continues to be identified as a multilingual learner, then the student needs to be provided with ESOL support. And as Robin said, those two types of services need to be provided in a cohesive and collaborative way. And it is the work of the IEP team and the Language Acquisition Committee to determine how that collaboration is going to look, what amount, frequency, type of service a student will receive based on their individual needs. Next slide. And we do have service provision recommendations in the state of Maine. Not all states provide these recommendations, but we developed them a few years ago, recognizing that we would like to have greater consistency from district to district in how much support students are receiving, and also wanting to be sure that we are meeting the minimum expectations of civil rights law. And so these are the recommendations that we have put forth for all students who are multilingual learners, including those who have disabilities. So for students in the beginning levels of acquiring English, we recommend that they receive at least 2 periods per day of ESOL support, which is direct support from their ESOL teacher. And for students who are in the higher levels of acquiring English, we recommend a minimum of 1 period per day. And as it says there, a period is defined as the amount of time that a student might receive some of their core academic instruction. For example, if a student has a 45-minute ELA period every day, then they would have a 1 45-minute period of ESOL support per day, or perhaps 2. And just to be clear that this is a recommendation, there are students who may require more support than this. We do not recommend providing less support than this to any identified multilingual learner. Next slide.
So it's important that, again, that collaboration piece between your ESOL educators and your special educators, so that the teachers of multilingual learners with disabilities will have what they need to understand those key concepts related to student development of a new language, and which instructional practices are evidence-based, research-based, so that we can help all students reach their highest academic potential. So again, keep emphasizing that collaboration between teachers so that the learning objectives that are outlined in the IEP can be met, and the language proficiency goals and objectives that are outlined in the individual language acquisition plan can also be accomplished.
Until now, we've primarily been focusing on the role of the educator in making sure that a student's needs are met. However, we really want to emphasize that families play an incredibly important role in that as well. And to communicate with families who have a primary or home language other than English, oftentimes that requires the use of an interpreter or a translator or both. And in the special education process, there are a few really key moments where that meaningful communication is especially necessary. One is when we are notifying parents or guardians of meetings that their attendance is welcomed and expected at, confirming dates and times, working with them to schedule things that in a way that meets their needs, explaining the special education process, and explaining their rights as a parent or guardian and the student's rights as well. One thing I want to make sure to note here is that it's so essential to make sure that you are finding out directly from families their preferences for communication. You may have some families who speak a language other than English, but are indeed quite confident in their English. And so you want to check in with them and find out, would you like interpretation or translation in this language? What is your preference? And then also we have families who may speak a language but not have literacy skills in that language, or have limited literacy skills. So for those families, interpretation may be the more appropriate means of communicating with them. And just to clarify that also, interpretation is oral language, translation is written language. So if a family has limited or no literacy skills, interpretation or oral language would be the most appropriate in those cases. Next slide. When you are facilitating an IEP meeting, it is very important to make sure that you have found an interpreter who can adequately translate or interpret for that meeting. And In the state of Maine, we do not have an official state level licensure for interpreters or translators. So it is really on, it's the onus of the school to make sure that they are working with someone who is qualified, who has had training and knows the ethical implications of the work of an interpreter. And it's also important to make sure that the interpreter is familiar with and comfortable with the language that is used in an IEP meeting and with special education law itself. There are resources available to help interpreters gain familiarity. There's a wonderful set of glossaries that the Massachusetts Department of Education produced. And so those are included in the manual. But just someone who is bilingual, but is not trained as an interpreter or does not have that awareness of special education language is not recommended to be used to interpret an IEP meeting. Next slide. Okay. So again, there are many key moments throughout the process that you want to make sure that you're having meaningful communication with families for. The first, starting with the referral itself, so that families are aware of what the referral is and why it is being made, that they understand the steps involved with the intervention, referral, evaluation, eligibility process. And also keep in mind that parents or guardians bring with them varying educational experiences and backgrounds. So they may be a fluent and confident speaker of a given language, but not have familiarity necessarily with all of the terms that are used in the education world and in special education in particular. So you want to make sure to find an interpreter who can really explain things in a clear way that families will be able to understand. And to support families in becoming familiar with the different service delivery models so that they can provide their input and preferences through the IEP process and understanding their rights and the procedural safeguards. So we do have translations of the procedural safeguards into many languages on the DOE website, on the special services page. So those are available for you to share with families. As far as the IEP meeting, we already addressed the fact that it's very important to make sure that a qualified interpreter is present for those. So not only so that educators can share information with families, but that families can also contribute information to the IEP because they have very rich knowledge of their student and they can help form that student's educational plan in a very meaningful way. But it may also be necessary to translate the written document of the IEP plan itself. And there's a notice through the DOE newsroom about that, that clarifies when and how an IEP document may need to be translated or interpreted. And that is included in the guidance manual as well.
There is a section in the manual with some frequently asked questions. And the question that comes up quite often is, can students receive both ESOL services and special education services? And yes, they definitely can. If they're found eligible for special education and related services, the IEP team, which will include the ESOL teacher or staff member, would be a part of developing the IEP for the student, and the IEP should include appropriate instructional program or combination of programs that will address the student's academic, functional, and language needs. Multilingual learners with disabilities are entitled to equitable access to all language acquisition program types offered by the school, which would include bilingual programs where applicable. So it isn't one or the other, okay? It's providing both services to meet all the needs of the student. Another question, what program options are open for multilingual learners once they're found eligible for special education? And again, the IEP team is going to make decisions about the appropriate instructional programming or combination of programs. And saying that all multilingual learners with disabilities are entitled to equitable access to all language acquisition program types offered by the school, including bilingual programs. And do multilingual learners with disabilities need an IEP or 504 plan to receive testing accommodations on state standardized assessments? And yes, accommodations in the correct sense of the word are available only as described in an IEP or 504 plan. However, assessments do have 3 levels of support. And Leora, I think I jumped on your slide. Do you want to take this? I'm sorry.
Okay, Robin. So there are 3 levels of supports. The first one are universal tools, and these are the things that are accessible to all students, all learners. The second is that the support should be determined on an individual basis. So the language acquisition team and the IEP team would work together to ensure that the child has all of the accommodations that they need and they're adequately documented in section 6 of the IEP so that everybody on the team knows what the child needs to access FAPE. And accommodations are changes in procedures or materials that don't alter what the test measures, and they're used to increase equitable access during assessment for students for whom there is documentation of the need for an IEP or a 504 plan. So accommodations that require an IEP or 504 would be a read aloud or a human reader, with the exception of reading sessions, Braille, or a scribe.
Okay, we included case studies in the guidance manual to just give you a few models and examples of how things might work out. So we have Kareem, who was born in Iraq and moved to the US when he was 7. Kareem speaks Arabic, his language proficiency at entering level, and he loves to play soccer and spend time with his older sister. He's helpful at home and he wants to learn. But due to the war in his country, Kareem wasn't able to attend pre-K or kindergarten. His parents didn't have the opportunity to continue their education beyond 8th grade. Kareem attended school in Iraq for 2 months before he moved to the US. He's one of 2 children. His sister is in the 4th grade. And please, please know April reminded us that Kareem is fictitious. All right, this is just, we made Kareem up. Okay, so his learning challenges, when he enrolled, his mom reported that he has been a slow learner. He had difficulty with Arabic pronunciation. He didn't pronounce his letter sounds clearly until he was 4. Currently, he still has some difficulty with letter sounds, and he's often searching for words that had been previously learned. Mom finds that he doesn't always retain what's been taught, and she's concerned about his ability to remember simple directions. Kareem's mother did share that he witnessed a bombing where many people were killed. He wasn't physically injured, but he has been affected by this. And he has trouble sleeping.
My apologies.
That's okay. That's okay. So Kareem has trouble sleeping. He's frightened by loud noises, and he doesn't like to be alone. So these are some action steps that would be taken given this information. And we've spelled this out in the manual to give you a model of what it would look like after you got that enrollment and background information. So the screener would have been administered to determine the multilingual learner status, English language development programming and differentiation in the classroom would be happening. A review of medical history with the screening of vision and hearing if needed. And Kareem would be enrolled in a first grade classroom, and we would hope that trauma-informed practices were in place or would be introduced. We'd gather baseline information about reading and math, and we'd monitor his progress closely, and we would meet as a team to discuss progress and differentiation and instructional strategies, and at that point determine whether referral to the MTSS or RTI team might be appropriate. If there were concerns, we want to maintain active communication with the parents as we monitor progress and gather any additional background information that would be helpful. If we can assess Kareem's language and literacy skills in his primary or home language, and perhaps consult with the speech and language pathologist if there are concerns that continue as the English language development progresses. And we may consult with the social worker or the guidance counselor to support Kareem's prior trauma and anxiety. So these action steps are a model for what a school can be doing. There are several acronyms and terms that need to be addressed, and am I stepping on anybody's toes here? Or is this mine?
I think it's technically mine, but this slide is really just to illustrate that there is an Appendix B, and that is all definitions that are specific to multilingual learners and special education terms. And the resources are in Appendix C, and this is just an example of what two of them are. I think the resources page is several pages long itself, so there's lots of good information there for folks. And there's also an additional resources section that you can see has links to Altella, Center for Applied Linguistics, and there's also a section on books that you can read to help further your knowledge. All right, April?
Yeah, just quickly, I want to make sure everyone has the link that will take you to the registration links for those 3 deeper dive sessions that we mentioned. So if you go to, actually that's the Multilingual Learners with Disabilities page, that is where you will find this session, both the slides and the recording. And then this page is where you will find the registration links for those future sessions. And we'll be happy to take questions for these last few minutes. I do want to make sure that before you leave us, though, that you know that on the next slide, there is a feedback survey and contact our certificate request form. So don't leave without getting that. But happy to take any questions. You can either put them in the chat or unmute if you would like. And Suzanne has asked, for Kareem, it suggests he is tested in his home language in reading and math. Where can those materials be obtained? Great question, Suzanne. And just to clarify also, sometimes it might be appropriate to do that, to evaluate a student using their home language skills. And other times it might not. And it comes down to a few factors. One is certainly how much education they received in that language versus how much education they might have received in English. So if a student, maybe their stronger language is Arabic, but most of their education has happened in English, then they're more likely to produce accurate or closer to accurate results about reading and math abilities through English, because that's the language of their schooling experience. But where those materials can be obtained, this is certainly a huge challenge for our field, which is that very few appropriate evaluative materials are available in languages other than English. There are some things that are available in Spanish, but those two can be hard to come by. So earlier in the presentation, we mentioned 3 possible routes or approaches to evaluation that include primary language and home language, and the use of an interpreter, although that is by no means the ideal solution. Many schools are using an interpreter to administer an assessment or an evaluation, and then interpreting the results of that assessment with a large grain of salt, recognizing that it provides a piece of the puzzle, but really is not definitive information because of its non-standard administration. And I see that Deb has her hand up, and then I'll answer Nancy's question in the chat, and Margaret.
Okay, so thanks. My question is specifically about early childhood and children through CDS, and some of the people on this webinar know that I'm the retired special ed director from Portland, so I'm familiar with K to 12, but I've most recently in the last year and a half been working with CDS, and I'm really curious about the home language survey. So it's my experience in working with CDS that we're not recognizing our CDS home languages through preschool unless the preschool happens to be in a public school. And I just want to know if there's any guidance on that. Like, is there a requirement even for our littles, like our birth to 2s and our 3 to 5? So I'm just curious about that. How do we identify that element for those young kiddos?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Deb. And you're correct that the requirement kicks in with a public school that a student would need to be identified as a multilingual learner. So that might be pre-K or K for many students. Prior to enrolling in a pre-K, or if it is a non-public pre-K, we have less direct ability to influence the practices that occur there. But if it is an organization that receives federal funding, then it is necessary for them to uphold Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which includes making sure that students are not discriminated against because of their national origin or language. So I think within that provision of Title VI, there's an expectation that a student who is a multilingual learner or dual language learner, as we refer to them at that age, would need to be identified as such.
So just so you know, right now, we're just asking, like in our meetings, we're asking parents those questions, like what language is spoken at home, the same questions that are in the home language survey. And we're thinking that that's an okay process because we're not going through any formal identification like a WIDA screen or anything like that. We're just doing the home language survey questions.
Yeah, well, and it is a little complicated, but I would say that a student at that age, if you have awareness of the presence of a language other than English in their home and community, and you have a sense that the student is very much still developing in their English, then there's a lot that can be done to support that student's language acquisition in both languages early on. So I think that gaining that clarity from interviews with parents and families and making sure that you're aware of the additional language or languages, that you are supporting the student's acquisition of all languages that exist in the student's life is a wonderful approach to begin with. Then once the student does attend a public pre-K or K program, that's when the official Maine Department of Education policy kicks in so that they are then identified in a formal way, including a screening. Okay, and then for Margaret's question in the chat, what is the process for students who take the alternate access to exit? Is there an exit score or a different process? There is a different exit threshold for students who are administered alternate access, and that is level P2. So that's a quick and easy answer on that one. And then Nancy's question is the BVAT not used anymore? That is the bilingual verbal ability test. And we've had significant conversation around that recently at the department. For those of you who are not familiar, the BVAT is, first of all, a very old, but kind of standing out by itself in a field of very few other assessments like it, a tool for determining just a general sense of a student's vocabulary in English and another language. And the reason it's stuck around this long, and remind me, Robin, maybe you can tell me, is it 1998, 98?
Yes.
Thank you. So it's been around for a long time and really hasn't been revamped since then. I think the reason it's still around is because, like I said, there just aren't a lot of other tools out there that can do a similar thing. But in our team discussion about it, we have stopped recommending it as a tool, partially because it is getting quite outdated, and many of the vocabulary terms that are included in it are things that it would be pretty unlikely for students to know. They're antiquated terms, obsolete terms. So we are no longer recommending it. If schools opt to use it, that is their choice to do so. But we're hopeful that there might be other ways of gleaning information about a student's language abilities other than BVAT. Yes, exactly. Covered wagon, like, yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that example. There's a lot of just kind of bizarre things in there.
Like candelabra is one of the words.
Yeah. Okay, other questions? We have just a couple of minutes. All right, Loyora, could you proceed to the next slide so that everyone has that QR code? If you would like a contact hour certificate for today, please do submit this form and I will get it to you as soon as possible. It might take me a little while, but you will get it. And we would really appreciate your feedback so that we make sure we're providing clear and valuable information and using your time wisely. I'm distracted by the funny things being said in the chat. What is that called now? I can't remember. Okay, so with that, our contact information is on the last slide. Robin, Leora, and I are very happy to answer any questions that you might think of after the fact. As you peruse the guidance manual a bit more and begin implementing it, do let us know if there's anything that we can do to support you in implementing it. And I invite you one more time to come to those 3 deeper dive sessions. The information for that, again, is right. Nope, don't have it loaded anymore. It's on the Multilingual Learners Professional Learning page.
And please share this information with anybody you can. We want to get the word out that this manual is available and has so many resources in it for all educators.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a pleasant afternoon.